You're in the right place for a conversation today about something that you told me once before, which is you see artificial intelligence as a technology that will amplify human ingenuity.
Absolutely.
How so?
So when we think about Microsoft's mission, we talk about, empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And at the session this morning, Carrie, who introduced the Women in Technology panel, talked about, our approach, I'll say, with artificial intelligence and how we want to democratize that technology and put it in the hands of everyone. And really what we're seeing is when we do that, the ideas and things that people do with it are mind-blowing. We just have, no idea that, they could do something like this to solve this type of challenge with this technology. The really cool thing is, like, with artificial intelligence, we know it's a game changer. We know it's going to change the way we work, the way we live our lives, etc. And the change is so profound that people think that we're in the midst of another industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution. So let's take a bit of a history.
Wait a minute, you don't think we are?
We are
Okay,
in the
good.
midst. We are in the midst of an industrial revolution with this game-changing technology. So with the fourth industrial revolution, one would say, of course, there's three before. So let's do a little walk through time and history and go back to the 1780s when we reached the upper limits of what we can. I'm getting to a point. I'm getting to a point. Come on. No, you're killing me. Okay, so we reached the upper limits of what we. I'm going to take a walk because Michael's really creeping me out here. We reached the upper limits of what we could do with our muscles. So what do we do when we reach those upper limits of what we can do? Well, we innovate. Well, what we know is that when we heat water to a certain temperature, it produces steam and it propels vehicles. And basically, we were at our limit of, how much, field we could farm and how much food we could produce, how we could transport that across the country, etc. But using those vehicles allowed us to, really amplify, the muscles and things that we could do to really achieve more. Now, we fast forward another 100 years, we get to the time of when we discovered electricity, and wow, now we could, light things all day, 7 by 24, we could propel things or power things that we couldn't in the past. And then the next revolution, fast forward another 100 years, where we get to the age of electronics. And now that's really the dawn of the age of data, et cetera, computing, et cetera. Now, fast forward a few years after that into the, fourth industrial revolution that we're in now, the difference that we're seeing is that pace of change that's occurring right now and those technologies that are coming to fruition that, are really game-changing, not in 100 years or one per generation, but one every 2 to 5 years. We're seeing things like IoT, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing that are significant and really changing the scope and landscape and such. But, just to kind of make the point around, with all those revolutions, we're seeing how those technologies really amplified our abilities. And if you'll indulge me, one more story. I was reading about a study that was done where we measured the efficiency and the effectiveness of an animal traveling a mile. Who can guess what the most efficient animal who can travel a mile on the planet? Physiology, etc. Any guesses?
Snail.
Close. Any guesses? Okay, no guesses. I won't leave people hanging. A condor. Anyways, but
close.
But the point I'm making is, when we put a human being on a bicycle, it blows the condor off the chart. Right, so that's a tool that a human being created to, stretch the physical boundaries that we had. So Steve Jobs said something interesting about this study, where the bicycle is essentially the computer, or the computer is essentially the bicycle of the mind. And when we look at AI, we can say, well, wait a minute, AI is the bicycle of the computer. Right, so basically, really fast forwarding our abilities to get to game-changing type of technologies.
So then let's go back to the 1700s, shall we?
Okay, yeah.
And when we had that first industrial revolution, we had the Luddites, and they were smashing the machines. And a lot of that had to do with the fear that we were replacing humans. And as we've known through the course of the previous 3 industrial revolutions, that while yes, there was a demographic that was left behind, we couldn't even predict the new jobs that were being generated as a result of those leaps in technology and leaps in humanity as a result. Now, what we've heard over the course of the day today is that the fourth won't be that much different in that respect. But having said that, you have a very interesting case study about how we're not replacing jobs as much as we're augmenting jobs.
100%. So there's a number of really great use cases, case studies, and being in Ottawa, I'll talk a little bit about Transport Canada and the work that we've done with them to amplify the ingenuity of the agents that are essentially responsible for the safety of our skies. And what the agents do is they would look at the manifests that come in and what are in the cargo shipments, et cetera, and determine, okay, is this something suspicious? Do I need to kind of take it aside? Is it one of the targets that I need to, investigate a little further? And really, that's a very painstaking process because essentially the Transport Canada agents would look at, wow, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of, cargo shipments, every year. And how many of them could they reasonably, look at and investigate and determine, hey, do I need to take a closer look at this? So what they did was, and Transport Canada had a start small but win big mentality. Let's start using artificial intelligence, natural language processing to determine which are the containers that I need to take a closer look at. And really what we saw was it reduced the number of hours that individuals needed to go through manifests and made them more effective at their jobs. It wasn't really about replacing the agents, but how do we make them more effective? And when we look at other examples, Transport Canada being one of them, but other examples of where artificial intelligence is, really changing the game. We, talk a little bit about healthcare and how we're using artificial intelligence to really improve, operations for a hospital or, the care continuum. So I'm, from Toronto, as Doug mentioned. I had a very long flight here, 40 minutes to come in, so it was, wow, crazy. But, so I'm a little jet lagged. So you can tell my energy level's a little low, so please excuse
Just a little low,
excuse that. So sorry about that. But with Markham Stouffville Hospital, what they did with using artificial intelligence and the power of cloud computing is to essentially look at all the operations within the hospital and allow administrators to understand what's going on in the hospital so they can optimize those operations. So when you're in the emergency room, there's challenges in terms of finding a bed for an individual once they've determined that, hey, we need to admit this individual into a hospital. So with that look, into all the operations of a hospital end to end, and to be able to use artificial intelligence to look at what's going on in the emergency room and determine, hey, this person's very likely going to need a bed. Let's make sure that we're setting things up, down the stream to essentially have that bed available for that individual. And what we saw with Markham Stouffville Hospital is they were able to reduce that time from when they determined that the individual will need a bed to actually getting the bed by 30% or so. And that's significant, right, to be able to do that, right? It's incredible. And there's other metrics and things that the hospital measures that they're able to improve in terms of emergency wait times, et cetera, by having that view. And it's incredible, right, to see that, healthcare providers, hospitals, et cetera, are using artificial intelligence and cloud computing to, really change the game.
A lot of those organizations, particularly in healthcare, I can imagine, and in government as well, for perhaps different reasons, more regulatory than privacy-oriented explicitly, we have to focus on those privacy rights. We have to, if we were to look at any keyword in this conference today, it would be trust. And below that would be your bias issues and your privacy issues that help ensure that we can trust this particular tech. How do you address the trust implications of what we're dealing with here? How do you check the bias of those who are checking the bias?
Ooh, interesting. Great question. So let me start with the bias and fairness. And at Microsoft, we've got 6 principles that we adhere to in terms of innovating responsibly when leveraging game-changing technology such as AI. And bias, clearly we talked about throughout the day that, hey, humans, we're creating that data, so there is bias in that data. But what are the types of techniques and things that we can do to determine, that there is bias and to mitigate those risks that occur? Well, I think one of the things is, what we're doing today and having the conversations and raising the awareness that that could potentially exist. And let me explain why that's really important, because a lot of times we think of the biases that, I don't know if this is the right word to use, but are not obvious, but that are more common that we talk about in terms of gender biases, ethnicity, et cetera. But there's a lot of biases out there that might be a little more subtle that we need to determine. So let's talk about artificial intelligence systems that are going to be used for consequential services such as prioritization of healthcare, where our healthcare system is stretched really thin, where limited resources, et cetera. So we might get into a situation where we use an AI model to determine who gets care over another individual. So I recently did a keynote at a healthcare conference, and I was looking at a data set around the topic. And the data set that I looked at was patients who went through care for pneumonia. And what we saw in the data set was the folks that have a chronic condition, asthma, responded quicker to the treatment than those that didn't. Okay, well, interesting. Now, what outcome could occur if you were to use that data set, maybe to train a model that would determine who gets prioritization of care in a hospital? Mm-hmm. So one might say that, well, hey, wait a minute, Nuzio doesn't have asthma, so let's prioritize his care because it takes him longer to recover. But wait a minute, when you take a step back and you look at the data and you understand really what's going on, the asthma sufferer is more in tune with their breathing, so they know that, hey, there's something wrong, I need to get care. I'm going to go get that care right away. Whereas Nuzio, I'm just a cold, tough it out, right? And I wait for, care, maybe a little longer than I should, but that could be an issue, right? I mean, significant issue for the asthma sufferer. If we were to, just automatically say, no, you have to wait, that could have dire consequences versus Nuzio, who, well, if you gave him the care a little later, it would be okay. And that kind of gets to the point where we've been talking about this all day. And how do we, kind of mitigate those biases by building a team who's developing these tools, techniques, algorithms, et cetera, that's diverse? We need, people that, that are asthma sufferers or others, in the group that are developing these assets so that we have that diversity as well in developing that.
As we had heard earlier, in the Turkish language, there is no gender. And therefore, when you translate nurse
Absolutely.
And it makes it feminine and masculine
Absolutely.
for doctor, that's an example. Had we had somebody on that team responsible for that technology who understood it, maybe we could actually find ourselves in a better situation. So
100%.
the diversity of team plays a big role in
100%.
ensuring that we remove bias.
And obviously, there's tooling and techniques and a lot of research is going into the topic. So I'll give a couple of examples. Word embedding is one algorithm that's used in this space of understanding whether or not there's bias in data sets. And what that means is essentially taking words and coming up with a mathematical formula of distance for those words and how close are they to other words. And I'll give an example that I apologize, it might be a little offensive, but man, woman, and then the distance to doctor, nurse, right? Are we seeing that man has a mathematical distance that's closest to doctor, and woman to nurse? And
Most
stuff, right?
doctors have been men, therefore the AI would assume a doctor is male.
Right. So but leveraging that tool could help us determine that, hey, there's a bias. And I was just using that example as, illustrative, but, those are tools and techniques that could be used to determine, whether or not you have a bias in data and, using that mathematical model to determine it.
How are you securing data? Because part of that whole trust exercise is not just the bias, but it is also recognizing the privacy implications of receiving a remarkable amount of personal data about a group.
100%. So 3 things: encryption, encryption, encryption. So, really, there's well-known techniques around, that data that's at rest. And what do I mean by data at rest? Well, it's just being stored, right? So essentially, there's encryption that, secures and protects that data. When it's in flight, similar type thing. So the encryption of that data as it's being moved from maybe myself to my bank, to my doctor, et cetera, that data is encrypted when it's being moved. But the challenge becomes when you need to do a calculation on that data, or you need to put it through a predictive model. Do you need to decrypt and then re-encrypt that outcome? And that, kind of raises a risk because your data then is in plain text. In comes, Microsoft research with homomorphic encryption, which allows us to perform calculations, et cetera, on that data while it's encrypted, and the outcome is encrypted as well, and it would have been like it was operated on in plain text.
You mentioned that there are 6 values that Microsoft has when it comes to artificial intelligence, and I can imagine one of them would be accountability.
Absolutely.
Another one, transparency.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if those, I would say those are separate values, but they would definitely work in tandem. How much transparency do we need to ensure accountability?
Oh, fantastic question. And those 2 values, when I draw them up on the board, those are the foundational values really that we must adhere to. And when we talk about transparency, it's about explainability of the algorithms. And I know we talked a bit up here about different approaches to talking about that and such. But really, it's about being able to explain the variables that go into deciding whether or not there's a reason for Nuzio got the loan, but Michael did not get the loan. And Michael comes in and talks about, well, why didn't I get the loan? You need to be able to explain that, right? And really, I like to use analogies, and I kind of use the analogy of like Doug said, I flew in from Toronto. I flew in an airplane. I would say that I know a little bit about the physics of how a plane flies. I'm an engineer and such, but I won't necessarily say that I understand everything that goes into the mechanisms that the pilot uses to fly the plane, et cetera. But I do know that a lot of training goes into what the pilots do. There's a rigorous maintenance schedule, et cetera. So I have that comfort that the plane is safe and will get me to my destination.
But you're still pretty upset when you're sitting on the tarmac.
Yeah, especially when the air conditioning's not on. That's crazy.
Exactly. You investigate AI for good. What examples do you have of AI for good for us?
Fantastic. So AI for Good is initiatives that Microsoft has launched, and really it's about tackling some of society's most important challenges. And I'll talk about 2 of our initiatives: the AI for Accessibility and AI for Earth. On the planet, there's about 1 billion people that have some form of disability, and the way I define a disability is someone who has a skill set that is mismatched with their environment. And I tell you, when I was in Gatineau at my hotel last night, everybody talking French, I was disabled. I could not speak French. I'm terrible. My grade 9 high school French is not cutting it. But anyways, from an AI for Accessibility program perspective, Microsoft has made a 5-year, $25 million commitment to building or helping organizations build applications that help address challenges that individuals with disabilities have to be able to interact with the world around them. And it's not just about the money that's being contributed. So that $25 million would go to using services like cloud, artificial intelligence, et cetera, on our platform. But also what we contribute is researchers, engineers, when we find that there's a idea that an organization has that is really going to transform the world, that's really going to scale, so we contribute our time. Then the third element of that program would be, let's get those capabilities within our offerings, within our Office 365 offerings, et cetera, PowerPoint Teams, et cetera, so closed captioning, translation services, all those types of technologies embedded in there. And then, the second element is around the AI for Earth. The second program is our AI for Earth program, where that is a 5-year, $50 million contribution or set of dollars that are set aside. But really, when we look at our planet, there's a interesting challenge, right, that we have around. We look at agriculture, and I've seen a study around by 2050, farmers will need to produce 70% more food than they're producing today to be able to feed the world's population. What about water, right? I mean, we'll need 30% more water for drinking, for hygiene purposes, et cetera. And the AI for Earth program, looks at how do we find organizations that will look at sustainability of the planet and use this technology to do that. We've got great examples of grantees in Canada around AI for Earth, and I'm actually one here at University of Ottawa, where they're using satellite imagery to look at patterns in farming and how farmland is changing. And I thought that was a fantastic example. There's another one at University of Waterloo where they're using similar type of approach, where they're using satellite imagery to look at forest fires and how they move and maneuver and how to better contain those forest fires. So a lot of great examples here in Canada of individuals and organizations leveraging that to address some of these societal challenges.
Well, Nuzio, I hope you overcome the jet lag.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you for your energy here today. We appreciate your time. Ladies and gentlemen, Nuzio Ruffalo, the National Transformation AI Officer at Microsoft.